Hello, my name's Cormac Cullinan. I'm an environmental lawyer based in Cape Town in South Africa, but I'm also one of the founders of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and more than almost 25 years ago wrote a book called Wild Law, which sets out a new vision of law. So what I'd like to speak to you about today is Earth Jurisprudence and the rights of nature. And essentially this is a story about changing our idea of law, the sources of law, the nature of law, and the purposes of law. And underlying that story is changing our idea of what it means to be a human being on this planet. I met Thomas Berry in 2001, and he'd written a document with 10 points on it called The Origin, Differentiation and Role of Rights. And one of the points on that list was, he said, as he said in many of his works, that the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And as subjects, everything in the universe is capable of holding rights. So this is a very fundamental shift in perception for people who've been brought up in the dominant cultures of the world today. It's not strange for indigenous cultures, but what essentially it means is that if the universe is a communion of subjects and not a collection of objects, that we humans are members of this incredibly beautiful, complex community of life, which we can refer to as Earth or the Earth community. It also means that we must have an ecological role within that community of life. Otherwise, we would no longer be here. We would have become extinct. So part of our role must be to contribute to the health and functioning and integrity of this community of life. It also means that our well-being as human beings is entirely derived from that community of life. Now, that's not just theoretical. All the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, our shelter, etc., all of that comes from other members of the community of life. We don't generate those things ourselves. So we, in a sense, are so integral to the community of life that, as Thomas said, we are more accurately understood as an aspect of Earth rather than something separate from Earth or living on Earth. Now, this is the actual reality. Indigenous cultures see it that way. Ecology, modern science, quantum physics all understand that we are an inextricable part of this whole, that we are absolutely entangled in this community of life. But that's not reflected in the legal systems of the dominant cultures. And the question is why? Well, one of the reasons, I think, is that in Europe in the 16th and 17th century, the so-called scientific revolution and the age of enlightenment, the idea of humans' role on the planet changed. Instead of seeing Earth or Mother Earth as this being which nurtured us and gave us life and everything we needed to exist, the perception shifted and we began to understand the world as mechanism. In other words, that the universe was like a giant clock full of cogs that interacted, and people were separate. We human beings had souls and everything else was mechanism or object. So at that point you had effectively a wall being built between human beings as subjects with souls on the one hand and the rest of the planet being objects or mechanism on the other. And what then happened is it hardwired into the system this idea that we humans weren't just separate, we were also superior. And our relationship with all the objects was one of exploitation. In other words, everything else existed as natural resources for us to use. So to give you an example of what that thinking does, if you think about it applied to humans, we used to define some human beings as objects. We called them slaves. Now, in that situation, it's very clear to see that a legal system which recognizes one human being as a slave owner with full rights, including rights of ownership over another human being who's defined as an object, a slave that can be bought and sold, it's very easy to see that that has been created to enable and facilitate the slave owner exploiting the slave. That's how the system is supposed to work. And that's exactly what we've done in our relationship with the rest of the community of life. By using the law to define as objects or natural resources which are available for exploitation and can be bought and sold, we are hardwiring in a relationship of exploitation and domination between humans and everything else. So the question is, now we're in that situation. The dominant cultures have legal systems like that and political and economic systems which correspond with that worldview. But we know it to be false. The idea that human beings are somehow completely separate from everything else is just simply scientifically indefensible. There would have had to be some radical discontinuity in the evolutionary process for us to be completely different. And we know that's not true. We can see the genetic lineages that are in our bodies are shared with many other beings on the planet. So how do we change? Well, the first thing we've got to do, as Thomas Berry pointed out, is we need a new philosophy of law. We need to change our idea of what law is. And that understanding needs to be guided by the reality that we are embedded in a universe which is ordered. The universe is not random, and Earth is not random. For example, it goes right the way down to subatomic levels. But if you think of water, it has a particular molecular structure. Because of that molecular structure of H2O, water flows. It also means that ice floats. All of these things are fundamental to how water behaves. And if you want to deal with water, whether you are an engineer or a lawyer, you have to take account of the essential nature of water. And we have to take account of the essential nature of the Earth community that we're part of, that it exists because of interrelationships and connections between all the members, and it's maintained by a vitality of flow throughout the system, a flow of life, a flow of nutrients, a flow of energy, a flow of genes, etc. So when I wrote Wild Law, I made up a name for the inherent principles of ordering which exist in the universe and in this planet, and I called it the Great Jurisprudence. So this is, if you like, is the wisdom or the ordering principles of the universe, which we can't argue with. They simply are, and we have to fit in with them. But then human beings, different human cultures, develop their own ideas of law. I call these Earth Jurisprudences, and I particularly use the plural there because different cultures develop different understandings which are culturally specific and also obviously affected by the particular environment that they live in. So indigenous cultures throughout the world have their own ideas of law and how it works and how human beings need to behave in order to be good members of the community of life and to flourish within that community of life. So many indigenous cultures, they wouldn't use the term Earth Jurisprudence to describe their ancestral jurisprudences, their ways of understanding law and the ordering of human society, which has been passed down over many, many generations. But effectively, because they fully understand the need to be aligned with the laws of nature, they are what I would call Earth Jurisprudences. This brings us to one of the most important points about the whole movement to change the mainstream legal systems, is that we need to learn from the indigenous cultures. These cultures didn't drink the Kool-Aid of separation, the idea that came out of the Age of Enlightenment in Europe that humans are separate from and superior to nature and should exploit nature. They never went there. So they've retained the original and scientifically correct understandings of the role of human beings within the Earth community. And they have learnt over thousands of years how to order their societies in ways which enable people to live and flourish without progressively degrading the wider community of life on which they depend. In other words, how to live without degrading your ecosystem or habitat from which your well-being is derived. Because it's very clear that if we continue to live as the dominant cultures do, by degrading our ecosystems, we may think we've got high standards of living, but it's achieved at the expense of the sources of life, of the sources of those well-being. We degrade our environment, and eventually that can only end badly, either for this generation or future generations, because no species that degrades its habitat can prosper in the long run and will eventually go extinct. So when we look at indigenous cultures, obviously they're very different, and it takes a real engagement to understand the depth of their understanding and to not misunderstand them. But essentially, almost all of them, probably all of them, emphasize, first of all, that we humans must be humble enough to learn what some cultures call the original instructions. We need to understand the rules of this community of life first. We need to understand, as with any community, if you want to be a member of the Earth community, as with any human community, you start by understanding the rules to live by, to live and let live within that community. They are very much emphasize respect. When you relate to other beings within that community, not just humans, maybe a river or a forest or a sacred place or an animal, you need to respect them, and you need to observe the principle of reciprocity. For every taking, there must be a giving, even if it's just a symbolic giving. So you may harvest a medicinal plant, but then you give at least a symbolic offering of tobacco or something like that in response, because it's to remind people that if you want relationships to be sustained, there must be a two-way flow. If you have a friend who feels that you just use them and they get nothing in return, that relationship won't end. It's the same with our relationships with other beings. And of course, they also emphasize responsibility. We humans need to take both personal responsibility and collective responsibility for our impacts on other beings in the community of life, and also for contributing positively to the integrity or the wholeness of the communities we form part of and to their functioning. We need to live in ways which also enable others to flourish and live. But if we look at those cultures and we've learned, we say, okay, we now see that we lost some really important insights in the process, and we want to change the dominant cultures. How do we import some of those understandings into legal systems of dominant cultures in order to change them so that they accord with the reality of what it is to be a human on this planet? Well, one of the hooks that we can use to pull in some of these insights is the idea of rights. This is a concept which is typically not found in indigenous systems, but is very central to mainstream legal systems. And of course, at the moment, these systems, rights are only held by human beings, so-called natural persons, or juristic persons. In other words, entities which humans have created, like the state, like corporations, etc. Because they are seen as subjects in the eyes of the law, they can have rights. All of nature is seen as object and can't have rights. So when we bring in the idea of rights of nature, it is a challenge to the existing legal systems, because first of all, traditionally trained lawyers are going to say, but that's impossible. A river or a tree or a bear or a lion can't have rights because it's an object, and objects can't have rights. So it first raises the question, but is it actually factually accurate to say that a dog or a bear or a river is just an object? Why isn't it a subject? If the universe is a communion of subjects, then they're all capable of having rights. So we need to, it first challenges our fundamental misconceptions of the other members of the community of life. Then the idea of rights is obviously a human construct. So if we say a mountain or a river has rights, it doesn't really care. It just carries on being a mountain or a river or a forest. But the real importance of recognizing rights of nature, and I say recognizing, not granting, because we're recognizing a pre-existing reality. The real importance of recognizing rights of nature is it creates corresponding duties on human beings, because we must then have duties not to infringe those rights. And that's the important bit. So if you look, for example, at the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, about half of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, which was adopted in Cochabamba in 2010, is human duties. It starts off with speaking of the rights of Earth and rights of nature, but the second half is really the human duties which are necessary in order to respect those rights. So at the beginning, I spoke about this being a story about what it means to be a human being on this planet, as well as reconceiving ideas of law. So it turns out that we aren't separate objects. We are ecological beings. We are more like coral reefs. We have many different organisms living within our bodies, on our skins, etc. And we are permeable. Air comes in and out, energy comes in and out, food, etc. So we are more like a part of a vast system of life. Life flows through us as through the system as a whole. And that shifts the emphasis to relationships and relatedness rather than seeing us and other beings as objects. And it also turns out that we are blinded to the importance of these relationships by defining everything else as an object. Because if you define everything as object, you don't worry about your relationship with an object. The question of relationship and relatedness arises between two subjects, between me and my friend, between me and my sons or daughters, etc. So it's really important that we shift away from the misconception that the world is object. Because once we do and we see the world as subject, we can see the relationships between the subject and that is the key to the flourishing of this planet. And then we can see that what law needs to do is protect the quality of those relationships, to make sure that those relationships are healthy and flourishing, both that the members of the Earth community can flourish and that the community as a whole can flourish, because we humans are just like one leaf on the tree of life. The idea that we can have human rights, this leaf can have rights, but the tree doesn't have the right to exist, or it has no rights, is absurd. The health of the leaf is entirely derived from the health of the tree. And it's the same. If we want to have human rights, we need to protect the rights of the whole, the rights of nature. And so, in summary, I believe that what we need to do as humans is realize that our role is to seek harmonious coexistence within the Earth community. Many indigenous cultures have these ideas. I know in Latin America people talk about suma causai or el buen vivir, the right way of living within the harmony with nature. That's what our role is as human beings, to find ways of harmonious coexistence with other beings within this incredibly beautiful, complex community of life, by far the most magical community of life we've been able to find anywhere in the universe so far. And if that's our objective, one of the key ways of doing that is to change how we structure society and how we make decisions. And one of the most effective ways of doing that is through the rights of nature, because that forces us to recognize the reality that we are one subject among many, and it focuses on our duties to maintain respectful and appropriate relationships with the other beings within society. So rights of nature, in a way, is part of a much bigger story, and it is part of redefining our role within this community of life in ways which will both benefit us and the community of life. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that we have an alternative. If we don't follow the indigenous understandings that we're part of a larger whole and act accordingly and restructure our societies accordingly, it's very hard to see that we have a long-term future. Thank you.